Hi everyone, I am Anupam. In this video, we'll discuss about private Google Access for privately accessing Google Cloud's public API endpoints. So let's get started. Let's talk a bit about theory and then we'll jump onto the demo. To understand the need of private Google Access, let's first understand the problem. So the problem is instances without public IP addresses can't access Google Cloud's public API endpoints. So for example, managed services like Google Cloud Storage have a public endpoint like storage.googleapis.com. And more often these Google Compute Engines or VMs need to communicate with managed services like Google Cloud Storage or BigQuery in order to put or get the data. So we have two options for this problem. So the first option is we can either associate an external IP with the compute engine and then that compute engine easily access these Google Cloud's public API endpoints. But that is not a secure approach. The second option is to enable private Google access. We can enable private Google access only on subnet basis. So when we enable private Google access for a subnet, instances in that subnet can communicate with Google Cloud APIs and services by using private IP addresses instead of external IP addresses. And this is the recommended approach by Google. This private Google access can also be extended to on-premises through Cloud VPN and Cloud Interconnect. Now let's discuss about this diagram. In this diagram, we can see that we have four VMs, VM A1, A2, B1 and B2. VM A1 and A2 are present in a subnet in which private Google access is enabled, and VM B1 and B2 are present in a subnet in which private Google access is not enabled. We can clearly see that VM A1, even though it only has private IP address, can access Google API and services because private Google access is enabled. But VM B1 cannot do that because private Google access is disabled. VM A2 and VM B2 both can access Google Cloud API and services because in case of VM A2, both external IP is also there and private Google access is also there. But in case of VM B2, external IP is there. So in both the cases, these two VMs A2 and B2 can access Google APIs and services. Now the important point to note here is that private Google access has no effect on instances that have an external IP addresses. In our case, VM A2. Now let's discuss about networking requirements for private Google access. The first requirement is your network must have an appropriate routes for the destination IP ranges used by these Google APIs and services. As we know that a default internet route is added when you create a VPC network. So you don't need to add an extra route for that, but you need routing if you have removed or deleted the default route of internet gateway. Now the important point to note here is that despite being called default internet gateway, the packets sent from the VM in your VPC network to Google Cloud APIs and services remain within Google's backbone network. Now the second requirement is that the firewall configuration of your VPC network must allow access from VMs to IP addresses used by these Google APIs and services. And we know that by default, VPC networks create two implied rules. One that denies all inbound traffic and one that permits all outbound traffic. So we need to permit the traffics for the IP addresses used by Google APIs and services. And we know that we have one implied firewall rule that will permit all outbound traffic. So we don't need to create any additional firewall rule until and unless we have overridden this particular firewall rule. Now let's jump onto the demo and see how private Google access works. So here we are on Google Cloud Console. Let's first create a VPC network. I am calling my VPC network as PGA VPC, a subnet for it. I am selecting the region as US Central 1, and this is the CIDR range I have chosen. And for the time being, I am not enabling private Google access. Now let me click create. It will take a bit of time to be created. Alright, so our VPC network has been created. Let me click refresh and then go to Google Compute Engine page. Let me create a compute engine. I'm calling my compute engine as PGA instance, and I'm selecting the region as US Central 1 because my subnet is present in US Central 1, leaving all the options as default and then selecting the appropriate network. So by default there was only one VPC in my project, so that is automatically selected. But let me expand this and choose none for the external IP addresses because we want to test private Google access. So as of now, I'm not associating any public IP address with my compute instance. Now let me create it. It will take a bit to be created. Alright, so our virtual machine has been created. Now let's go to cloud storage and let's create a storage bucket. So I'm calling it as PGA cloud storage and say a random number, or I can append the date. Let me choose the default options. Let me click create. My bucket has been created. Let me upload one file. There is a file called gcp.txt which I have created and placed on my desktop. I am uploading this file in my bucket. So the file has now been uploaded. Now let's go on to the compute engine to access this instance. But before accessing this instance, we need to add a firewall rule. Now click on this VPC, click on firewall, click on add firewall rule. Allow SSH from IAP. I am selecting the VPC, that is automatically selected. I am saying that apply it to all instances in the network. This is the IAP range, and then I need access on port 22 because I want to SSH onto the machine. So this looks good. Let me click create. So our firewall rule has been created. Let's again go to the compute engine. Let's try to SSH the virtual machine that we created. Alright, so I'm inside the virtual machine. Now let me try to access the cloud storage bucket content. So for visibility purposes, let me open it in a new tab. So this is my bucket. Now I'm inside the virtual machine, and let me use the gsutil command to get the content of this bucket. So I'm using gsutil cp and then the bucket name, say pga hyphen cloud hyphen storage hyphen 240724, and then say I want that, okay, I need all the txt files to be downloaded where in my current directory. Let me hit enter. you notice that it is not downloading the content because my virtual machine doesn't have a public IP, as well as I haven't enabled the private Google access. So let me close the operation. Let me go to the VPC network and let me click VPC and let me click on that subnet. Let me edit the subnet and enable this private Google access. Now the private Google access has been enabled on the subnet. Now let me again go here and execute the same command. Now see, it is now able to access this endpoint. That's it for the demo. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.